So many people were so disappointed by the launch of the 4060 Ti with only 8 gigabytes of VRAM on its $400 model. And so a lot of comments I've seen on my videos are, I'm just gonna go to Intel. They've got the A770, it offers 16 gigabytes, although do be careful, there's also an 8 gigabyte version, and right now the difference is only $20. So, $330, it costs a lot less than a 4060 Ti, it delivers double the VRAM, maybe Intel's the way to go. But slow down for a second, AMD already kind of is the budget option when you're looking at GPUs. Has Intel managed to supplant them? Well, also, what kind of performance is Intel actually delivering? Gigabytes of VRAM isn't the only metric. So I've done a video comparing the A770 versus the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte, but in this video, we're gonna look at the AMD offering. So we have the 6700 XT from AMD, which comes in with 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so not 16, but 50% more than 8. It is a big difference and does matter in some games. And it's also coming in at a lower price than Intel's A770. Looks like the cheapest model I could find if I was buying right now would be $310. And then there are some models that get more expensive from there at $320, $360, all that kind of stuff. Now in this particular video, the Intel Arc GPU I'm using is the Predator Bifrost cooler. And we can see it does run at some pretty high temps in a lot of my tests. And then we've got the AMD's reference cooler on the 6700 XT, which also runs at some pretty hot temperatures. But in general, we're gonna be looking at, honestly, kind of a softball for Intel here. I'm gonna be testing like the latest AAA games. These are DX12 games. If you know things about Intel Arc GPUs, one of their biggest shortcomings is older games and older graphics APIs like DX8, 9, 11, all of that. Here we're looking at the latest releases. We're gonna give them a pretty easy time, but I think we're gonna find out that, is there only room for one budget GPU brand? Let's run the benchmarks and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. All right, let's start out our testing with one of the latest AAA games. It's very graphically demanding. It's Unreal Engine 4, pushed about to its limit. It's current gen only, so we're not looking at cross-gen old console support or anything like that. And at 1080p maximum epic settings with ray tracing turned on, the 6700 XT is able to deliver over 60 frames per second, while the A770 is down in the 40s. Both GPUs are using more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, so that's helping here, but we're not going past the 12, and it's a 42% lead for the 6700 XT in the averages, and in the 1% lows, it's a 77% lead. Now, what if we turn down some settings? So we turn off ray tracing, go down to high instead of epic. Well, now we see the 6700 XT up over 90 frames per second, and the A770 is now into the mid-60s, giving a solid experience. However, that does mean the 6700 XT is winning by 33%, which is a bit less than what we saw with the maximum settings, but the 1% lows are now an 88% lead for the 6700 XT. We're talking almost 80 frames per second versus 41 when we're looking at the 1% lows, and the frame time graph on the Arc GPU is a lot spikier. Now, what if we turn up resolution? 1440p epic settings, ray tracing on, neither GPU is giving us a 60 frames per second experience, although the 6700 XT is perfectly playable in the mid-40s. I'm not saying it's the settings I would use, but there's certainly settings that some people could use. And then the A770 is hanging out around 30 frames per second, although the 1% lows do dip below that. This is a 32% lead on average for the 6700 XT and a 36% lead in the 1% lows. And so what if we, though, turn down the settings and get rid of ray tracing, go back to the high preset? Well, now the 6700 XT is hanging out very close to 60 frames per second a lot of the time. And the A770 is now down into the upper mid-40s, closing in on 50 FPS a lot. Overall, the 6700 XT's lead has definitely reduced here. It's down to 22%, but it's certainly still a noticeable lead. 60 FPS versus down below 50. And in the 1% lows, it's a 71% lead for the AMD GPU. The frame time graph on the Intel GPU you can see looks a lot more spiky. Now, what if we turn up to 4K resolution for some reason? Really just kind of testing for science, although I know sometimes people will hook their PC up to like a 4K TV from every now and then on a game where you're gonna get reasonable frame rates or something. Anyway, if we do test out 4K resolution, we do see that the A770 does scale up better relatively the higher the resolutions go. So the 6700 XT's lead has reduced, but it's still a 12% lead and a 32% lead in the 1% lows, although both GPUs are below 30 frames per second much of the time. So I think realistically, if you're going to play at 4K, you'd want to upscale and or turn settings down even further. But let's look at another current gen only game with A Plague Tale Requiem. This is a custom engine from Asobo Studios. At 1080p Ultra, the game looks excellent. The 6700 XT is averaging in the mid-70s. The A770 is in the upper 60s, but it is still a 13% lead for the 6700 XT and a 56% lead in the 1% low, because look at that weird frame time graph and spikes that we're getting on the A770. It's all over the place. So despite having a close average frames per second, the overall smoothness of the experience is much better on the AMD GPU, but we see that kind of smooth out at 1440p. If we go up to 1440p Ultra settings, we're now seeing only a 6% lead for the 6700 XT, so a much better showing for the Arc GPU here. 14% lead for the 6700 XT in the 1% lows, but we're not seeing the crazy spikes anymore. Perhaps that's because the high frame rates have been brought down closer to the low frame rates, so we're just not getting the up and down swing quite as much. I don't know. But if we go up to 4K resolution, we now see the A770 pretty much delivering the same experience. They're tied in the 1% lows. The 6700 XT has, by the end of my scene, like a 1 FPS advantage of like 27 versus 26, no, sorry, 26 versus 25. It's a 4% lead. It's not that meaningful. So they basically tied at 4K, but they're both below 30 frames per second. Now, let's move on to some PlayStation 5 exclusives. With The Last of Us Part 1 at 1080p Ultra settings, the 6700 XT is averaging around 80 frames per second. It's doing a great job. Frame time graph is very smooth. The game's using more than 8 gigabytes, so it gives a lot of GPUs trouble here. But the A770 couldn't even run the game. It would just crash repeatedly every time I would try to start it up. Sometimes it would start up a little bit, but it couldn't even get through the shader compilation and it would just crash again. But as we move into 1440p high settings here, notice I did turn down to high to get around 70 FPS on the 6700 XT. The ultra settings weren't over 60, so I'm just showing you the high settings here. But here I'm showing you that there are some patch notes. So after I completed my testing, there was an additional patch to the game which fixed some stability things, including a crash on boot impacting all Intel Arc GPUs. So if I had had time to go back and retest, it's possible we could have got some data here. But this does just go to show that a lot of times Intel GPUs just don't have as smooth of a software experience and support as AMD and Nvidia do when games launch. Now, another PS5 exclusive game with Returnal at 1080p Epic settings. This game's not nearly as hungry on VRAM as The Last of Us is, so we're not seeing this one go over 8 gigabytes. But here we're seeing the 6700 XT with a 22% lead on the averages and a 12% lead in the 1% lows, but they're both doing a very good job. The 6700 XT is over 90 FPS though, and the A770 is in the mid-70s. If we go up to 1440p Epic settings, we're now seeing a 15% lead for the 6700 XT, and now the Arc GPU gets its first win, with the 1% lows being an 8% lead for the Arc GPU. So it is finally ahead in something, although it's still behind in the average FPS in this game. But overall, this game seems to be a better showing than we saw in other Unreal Engine 4 game we tested, because this is Unreal Engine 4, like the Jedi Survivor game was. Returnal at 4K Epic settings, we're now seeing the 6700 XT only winning by 3%, so it's basically a tie, and the A770 winning by 4% in the 1% lows, still basically a tie, and both GPUs really only averaging in the upper mid-30s, so it's not necessarily something to get too excited about. You'd want to turn down settings or upscale or both for sure if you were actually playing on these GPUs at 4K. Now, one more PlayStation 5 exclusive. How about Forspoken at its maximum preset called Ultra High, which does include some ray tracing. And I also turned off the upscaling, the preset itself upscales. Here we're seeing the 6700 XT averaging over 60 frames per second, but the Arc GPU is down in the mid-40s. It's a 36% lead for the 6700 XT. However, at 1440p, the lead drops to only a 17% lead for the 6700 XT, and it's now barely averaging over 40 frames per second, but the Arc GPU is down in the 30s, so it is still noticeably more playable on the AMD GPU, although realistically I would want to turn down settings here. And if we go up to 4K resolution, this game starts to use more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM. So here we actually are seeing the 16 gigabytes versus 12 paying off, giving the A770 a 17% lead by the end of the benchmark run. However, it's a Pyrrhic victory. Both GPUs are losing. They're down around 20 frames per second a lot of the time, so it's just not very meaningful. Let's move on to Unreal Engine 5. So many new games will be using this engine, but right now we don't have many out. We do have Epic's own Fortnite. I'm using the game's replay feature to gather the side-by-side footage, and at maximum settings at 1080p, so Epic settings with ray tracing on, neither GPU is able to deliver us a 60 frame per second experience on average. However, the 6700 XT is a lot closer, averaging in the mid-50s, versus the A770 down in the upper 30s. It's a 42% lead for the 6700 XT here, and a 43% lead in the 1% lows. However, if we turn down to high settings and turn off ray tracing, both GPUs do a lot better. The 6700 XT is now averaging 100 frames per second, and this still includes Lumen and Nanite and virtual shadow maps, just things turned down a bit. Whereas the A770 is still not breaking 60 frames per second. We're down in the mid-50s. It's a 79% lead for the 6700 XT on average, and it is doubling the performance in the 1% lows, which is absolutely major, especially because Unreal Engine 5 is probably the most important new engine as far as just new games having committed to using it. At 1440p, the gaps close a bit. Maximum Epic settings with ray tracing on, the 6700 XT isn't doing great. It's in the mid-30s. The A770 is below 30 frames per second. It's a 29% lead for the 6700 XT and a 27% lead in the 1% lows. So while the A770 got closer, it's still well behind, and neither GPU is doing great at these settings, so these are not going to be maxing games out at 1440p in Unreal Engine 5. However, if you turn down to high settings instead of Epic settings and you turn off ray tracing, the 6700 XT is now able to average in the mid-60s, upper mid-60s, whereas the A770 is down in the low 40s. It's a 58% lead for the 6700 XT on average and 56% in the 1% lows. This is really not a good thing to see for the Intel Arc GPU because, like I said, Unreal Engine 5 is major. Now, I can't say that Fortnite is going to, tell us what every Unreal Engine 5 game is going to be like, but certainly not excited to see these results. Now, at 4K is kind of unrealistic for both, but at the high preset, the 6700 XT is able to average in the mid-30s. Whereas the A770 is down in the mid-20s. It's a 30% lead for the 6700 XT in the averages, and a 35% lead in the 1% lows. Now, over the next year, we should start to get a new crop of actual Unreal Engine 5 releases from third parties and not just from Epic. And I'm hoping to see Intel close the gap a bit. But let's move into some cross-gen games. Resident Evil 4 at its maximum preset does include ray tracing, although I turned it off even on my 4090 because it just looks bad. But hey, at the maximum preset, the 6700 XT has a 15% lead on the averages, but a 46% lead in the 1% lows, and it's averaging in the mid-70s versus the mid-60s. They're both very playable. But yeah, the frame time graph on the A770 was a lot less stable. And what if we turn off ray tracing by just going to the prioritize graphics preset? Now both GPUs are doing great. The 6700 XT is averaging over 120, and the A770 is close to 100 FPS average. Although that is still an 18% lead for the 6700 XT, and a 61% lead in the 1% lows. The 1% lows are 69 nice versus 112, so very much smoother experience on the 6700 XT. Now let's kick up the resolution. So at 1440p, first we'll test out the maximum preset, which again does include ray tracing. We're seeing a 15% lead for the 6700 XT on the averages, but a 40% lead in the 1% lows. The 6700 XT is able to average a little over 60 FPS, with the A770 hanging out in the lower 50s. But the 1% lows are more like 40 versus 56, so it is still a much more consistent experience on the 6700 XT. But what if we go with the prioritized graphics preset, which turns a few things down, including turning off ray tracing? Now, both GPUs are doing a much better job. The A770 is in the mid-70s, the 6700 XT is in the upper mid-80s. And that's a 15% average lead for the 6700 XT, but a 42% lead in the 1% lows. So once again, a very smooth frame time graph on the 6700 XT, especially comparatively. Now, if we go up to 4K resolution at the maximum preset, including the ray tracing, the 6700 XT is delivering around 40 frames per second. The A770 is down in the 30s. It's a 14% lead for the 6700 XT and a 30% lead in the 1% lows. They're both, technically playable, especially if you want a controller or something, but still, I think it would make sense to turn down settings or just not use these GPUs at 4K. But anyway, if we turn down settings to prioritize graphics, we're now seeing very close behavior here. It's only a 7% lead for the 6700 XT on the averages, although still a 27% lead in the 1% lows. The 6700 XT is averaging, in the 47-ish, and the A770 down there around 44-ish. So, yeah, it's kind of mid-40s versus upper mid-40s. Not that big of a difference, although, again, the 1% lows certainly help. Now, another cross-gen game we'll take a look at here is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and I'm using the balanced preset rather than the extreme preset because I think it's more like how people actually use competitive shooters. And here we're seeing a dominant victory for the 6700 XT. It's a 68% lead in the averages and a 95% lead in the 1% lows. It's 165 FPS versus about 97. And so, I mean, it's not that the Arc GPU isn't delivering a perfectly usable experience, but the 6700 XT is very dominant here. And moving up to 1440p, A770 closes some ground, but it's still a 50% lead on average for the AMD GPU in both the averages actually and the 1% lows. The 1% lows on the A770 do dip below 60 to around 57, whereas we're up around 86 on the AMD GPU. Now, again, not that 4K is the most realistic thing, but can be kind of interesting to test, see how they scale. Once again, the Intel GPU does close some ground the higher the resolution gets, but it's still a 32% lead on average for the AMD GPU and 34% in the 1% lows. And it's the difference between the 6700 XT averaging still over 70 frames per second here, with the A770 down in the mid-50s. So if you play a lot of Call of Duty, and it's the same engine as Warzone 2, certainly consider that when you're thinking about the AMD GPU. It does very well there. Now, the last cross-gen game we'll look at is Cyberpunk 2077. We'll start out without ray tracing, but the main reason I want to look at this game is for ray tracing and upscaling, because it does support both FSR2 and XeSS. Anyway, at 1080p ultra settings, the 6700 XT is over 90 FPS, and the A770 is over 80 FPS. It's an 11% lead for the 6700 XT, and a 16% lead in the 1% lows. They're both doing well here, and it looks like the A770 is a lot closer in this game than it was in some of the other games we tested, especially as we move up to 1440p at the ultra preset. We see the 6700 XT only leading by about 1 frame. It's a 2% lead, not very meaningful, and a 4% lead in the 1% lows. Again, they're delivering pretty much the same experience, which is good to see. Now, looking at the frame time graphs, it does still feel like the 6700 XT's graph just looks a little bit less spiky, which is something to think about. But anyway, about the same performance there. However, the main reason I wanted to use Cyberpunk was as a heavy ray tracing benchmark. So 1080p RT Ultra. This is not even the RT Overdrive path tracing, but just RT Ultra. We're seeing the A770 come out 23% ahead on the averages and 24% in the 1% lows, but it is a fairly Pyrrhic victory as it's still only averaging about 30 frames per second itself, whereas the 6700 XT is down in the mid-20s. So neither GPU is giving a very good experience with heavy ray tracing. However, that's where you might want to kick on some upscaling. So here we're enabling both XeSS and FSR2 at the quality preset, so giving each GPU its own branded upscaler. And I do think XeSS is looking better here. If you look at the fence and the palm tree branches, I think they look noticeably more stable using XeSS, which is more of an AI accelerated and trained algorithm, more similar to DLSS than FSR2 is, and the A770 performance-wise still has an 11% lead on the averages and 17% in the 1% lows. Now, I don't really like upscaling at 1080p at all, especially not so aggressively, but I did test out the performance setting. For one thing, to see the visual quality when you push the upscalers to their absolute limits. And I do think XeSS is, again, looking at the fence, looking at the palm tree branches, things in the distance. I think XeSS is reconstructing more detail, and it's doing it more stably, less shimmering. However, they're both now averaging around 60-ish FPS. The Arc GPU is 5% ahead on averages and 8% in the 1% lows. Now, interestingly, though, both GPUs can use each other's upscaler. So if we felt like XeSS looked better, I thought it would be interesting to try out using XeSS on both GPUs. Again, you could have done it vice versa with FSR on both. And here we see the 6700 XT using XeSS fall a little further behind performance-wise. So it did perform better using FSR2. XeSS, when it runs on other brands of GPUs, it has to use a DP4A fallback rather than using the Arc GPU has its own XMX, like basically a tensor core type matrix accelerator thing. All that really matters here is that Intel's hardware can run its own algorithm quicker than other GPU vendors can. So performance-wise, AMD did better using FSR. But image quality-wise, it is now delivering a more stable image with XeSS. I actually want to do this as maybe a video topic in the future, is look at AMD GPUs using FSR versus XeSS and which one you should choose in which games and which GPUs. All right, so some final thoughts. Basically, I just can't recommend Intel's Arc A770. Yes, it offers 16 gigabytes of VRAM. That is more than 12, but honestly, we didn't really see that mattering. 12 seemed to be enough when you needed more than 8, unless you were running 4K Ultra settings in Forspoken. That was the only place where it seemed to make any difference in this test suite of games. So if the extra VRAM doesn't really matter versus the 12, what would be the reason to buy the Intel GPU? I'm trying to think, fairly here. I do see that the Intel Arc GPU does have AV1 encoding support. So if you were needing AV1 encoding for some kind of streaming or I don't think it works on Twitch yet, but I think it does work on YouTube, and then you could have, other video encoding needs. AV1 encoder, that is nice to have, and the Arc hardware does have that, while the 6000 series from AMD does not. So there's that, but really I'm grasping at straws to give you a reason why you should spend more money on a GPU that is consistently performing significantly slower than a GPU that, costs about the same or less. So basically, Intel's running into a bit of a problem here, which is, if they want to compete on value, and their marketing is always hammering on their value compared against Nvidia. And it's true, they can offer better value than Nvidia in a lot of situations. But the problem is AMD is already offering better value than Nvidia. And it looks like in this head-to-head comparison, at least with the A770, they're doing a better job of offering better value than Nvidia does. Now, we did see some interesting things with the architecture. So the higher you push the resolution, the better Intel performs relatively. But it never really made that much of a difference as far as actually gaining a lead. More often, it would occasionally get a tie, but in a lot of major games, it was still significantly behind. So yeah, it's just really hard to come up with reasons why you should buy the Intel GPU. I think some people are just wanting to support a third player in the GPU space, and I certainly agree that we need more people in the GPU market. Like, having a third major player is a great thing. We need to see more price competitive options, things like that. Like we've seen with this latest launch of GPUs from Nvidia with their 40 series, very high pricing. Most GPU models price increased significantly compared to the previous generation, and those that didn't, like the 4060 Ti, offering not much in the way of an actual performance improvement. And then AMD not really releasing a lot to compete with that, right? So far, at least with their 7000 series. So, in other words, I think having a third player in the space can only be a good thing for the consumer. And I think actually, if we do get AMD and Intel having to battle it out for who's going to be second place, then maybe it will push them both to be more aggressive in pricing. The only thing that I would really hate to see is if it actually just chased one of them out of the market because maybe there wasn't room. Like, hopefully some of them could start gaining market share from Nvidia. It does seem like Intel is more directly targeting Nvidia in terms of what it's trying to do. It's offering its XeSS AI upscaler, AI-based machine learning trained upscaler with more of the hardware acceleration for that. So they're certainly taking more of that NVIDIA type of route compared to what AMD has done. And also, I think, dedicating more of their hardware to actual heavy ray tracing support. We did see that pay off a little bit with the heavy ray tracing test in Cyberpunk. But we saw in a lot of the other ray tracing games, they use a lighter ray tracing workload, like we tested here with Fortnite, with Jedi Survivor, Resident Evil 4, I might be forgetting with some other ones, Forspoken. It really didn't give them the lead over AMD here. And then also, as I play this footage in the background, we did see some software support issues, like crashing in Last of Us Part 1, and that's really not good to see. Again, we did see the patch to address this, but just in general, you're a lot more likely to see these kinds of software bugs and support issues on the Intel GPUs than you are on the more mature and wider market share of software with AMD and Nvidia. And again, I do need to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the video, which is I gave Intel a softball here. My test suite, really more because I chose this game test suite for really looking at the new generation of 40 series and 7000 series from AMD and Nvidia. But it happens to be that I like to focus on the latest games, right? So big new AAA games, these happen to be all DX12 games, all of that. And that's where Intel has the best chance of competing. Because once you start getting into older games, DX8, DX9, DX11, you start running into more support issues as well as just performance issues because AMD and Nvidia have had decades of, basically every time a new game comes out, they've been able to optimize their drivers for that. Intel was not able to do that as all of those games released. So I think if I did a different test suite of games that included older and more obscure titles, you would see even more issues for Intel than what we saw in this video. But even giving them the best situation that I really could for gaming performance, we were still unable to see the A770 take on the 6700 XT. Priced similarly, 6700 XT is actually cheaper right now. So yeah, that's just where we're at. I don't think I can recommend the A770. I think if you're considering not buying an Nvidia GPU, the 6700 XT from AMD should be your next choice, or possibly your first choice if you look at the price to performance of the 67. Honestly, guys, the 6700 XT right now just makes a lot of sense. If it's priced around $300, 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so you're not running into those issues of games spilling over the 8, a lot of performance for 1080p, reasonable performance for 1440p. It's honestly a tough to beat card right now. Anyway, it gets very close to the non-ray tracing performance of the 4060 Ti even, and I've done a head-to-head of that. Now, some of you guys are maybe screaming, you should have tested the A750. That's where more of the value is from Intel. I will admit that I do think the A750 can offer more value than the A770. I did not have a chance to update my testing in this set of games that I just tested for the 4060 Ti and 7600 launches. However, I did test the A750 fairly recently, just a few months ago. There have not been a lot of major driver updates to change any of the results from that video. So I could point you in the direction of my A750 tested against I think it was the GPUs that were similarly priced at the time, which I believe was the RTX 3050 and RX. It was either the 6600 or the 6600 XT. I think it was the XT version, where in that video I once again concluded that the A7, the Intel GPU was offering better value than Nvidia was at the price point, at least in some cases. But again, it was having a hard time justifying buying it over the AMD GPU, which also offered a lot of performance per dollar. But again, my memory on that one could be a little bit hazy, so go ahead and watch that one fully for the full testing. And again, that was just a couple of months ago, and not a lot of major driver update changes since then. All right, guys, I hope you found this one useful. I think it really is interesting testing out how Arc plays out over time with updated drivers and all that, and I am very interested to see what they offer next. Huge thank you to channel members who have hit the join button and help directly support the channel. I don't get GPUs like the Intel A770 sent to me as a review sample. I did have to buy that one. So it's really nice to have the direct financial support. Now, I completely understand not everyone is in a position to or wants to do that. That is absolutely fine. Huge thank you to just viewers, channel subscribers, all of that. You're all excellent people. I hope you all have an excellent day.